very much, everyone. It's wonderful to be back. I can't believe 2 years has gone since we did Peter Grimes. It's kind of incredible. Tonight is not going to be so much a lecture, so you can all breathe out. I'd like it to be much more of an informal engagement with everybody. And I'm going to approach the talk in 3 parts. Trying to put myself in everybody's position, possibly encountering this kind of music for the first time. What would be the most useful thing I think I could give you? So in the first case, we'll take a little bit of a look at the historical context of how did we get to the point of the music that John Adams wrote for this opera. So there'll be a little bit of a survey of 20th century music, like a thumbnail sketch, okay? And then in the second part, we'll take a look at aesthetics a little bit. What are the aesthetics of this music? What are we going to experience when we go into the theatre in terms of the feeling of the thing, okay? And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about opera itself and how that works. Does that sound like a plan? Okay, so let's kick off. I'm going to play you a piece of music, and I'm going to do something very irritating that professors do all the time. I'm going to talk over it. But it's a little piece of musical analysis that I want us to do together, and I want you in particular to listen out to repetition, okay, in this piece. It's a fanfare. I figured, why not start with a fanfare, right? Now, hopefully this will play. So we have a scale that goes up. We have thirds that fall. We have little repeated notes. Second phrase, rising scale, repeated rhythm in the drum, falling thirds. Now the second section of the piece, a little repeated rhythm and a melody. That rises and falls, leans up and falls, almost like climbing a small hill. The melody kind of repeats. All the time with a repeated rhythm, I know. Again, it reaches up. Similar shape, but different notes. Now the third section is probably the most relevant to us tonight. So we're going to go on the scale. Da, da, the second. The repeat. We have a third. Da, da, da. Da, we have a fourth. Da, 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 da. Da, we have a fifth. Gradually move up the scale. Each of the notes being added, being repeated to create a texture. And the whole group move up as the scale widens. Rhythm on the drums, designed to slow it down. Now, like the beginning, the rising scale, but slower. And finally, the thirds, but now free. And the texture's made up of those thirds echoing and repeating, right? And then finally, chords. Okay, so there are a number of different types of techniques that were involved in that piece, but could you tell how a lot of it was built on repetition, okay? And could you also tell how the textures were built up from almost echoes? What's called actually heterophony, if you want one of those Scrabble words, right? Heterophony, okay, which is basically a harmonic structure that is built not from independent harmony, but actually from echoing the notes of the tune. Okay, at the very end we have the chords, which are homophony. That's where we have chords that are independent of anything else, and we tend to feel those as expressive, moving moments, where we're led forward in time, whereas heterophony tends to generally create a sense of staying static, for want of a better word. It's a lot more nuanced than that, but that'll do for now. Did anybody spot the composer? Ring any bells? The composer was me. I figured I might as well start out with a piece of music that I know a lot about. Okay, so that basically was the thought processes that went into making that little tiny fanfare. Okay, so there are a couple of little techniques there that I've put out there. Now, we're going to go back in time for a moment to Germany, to German music. A little bit of politics, okay? We're talking about Germany here in what's called the fin de siècle, the end of the era, around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And in 1910, a composer called Gustav Mahler. Anybody heard of him? Mahler, okay. I figured there might even be a few fans in the room, right? Died in 1911, conducted the New York Philharmonic, actually. But he wrote his 10th symphony, didn't get to finish it. That was finished by some Englishmen in the 1960s. It's a long story. But he did get to orchestrate the first movement. And I just want to use a couple of bars of this to illustrate something. And what it's going to illustrate is, what I want you to listen out for in particular, is what's called the chromaticism of the music. It's very chromatic. In other words, the melody, such as it is very distorted, if you will, okay, by wide leaps and by chromatic movements that make us feel somewhat anxious. And then there's a big build-up of a 12 or 11 note, actually, an 11 note chord. It's a famous moment in musical history. Let me just play a few bars of this for you. Very high. It's like super expressive. Then we get these chords, this big chord. It's like a nightmare in sound, right? It's the First World War and the Second World War about to happen. Single trumpet notes. And again, screaming violence. And I just want to use those few bars very crudely, okay, to summarise what had happened as a tradition. And there's no getting away from the fact that there is a certain sort of political dynamic to this, because it's German. Okay, we have Bach, we have Handel, we have Beethoven, we have Haydn, we have Mozart, we have Bruckner, we have Schubert, we have Schumann, we have Bruckner, we have Mahler. Goodness, no wonder the Germans thought they were the master race. Okay, why would they bother with any other music with such a supreme tradition? But this tradition was right at the point of collapse in 1911, as you just heard. Wagner's operas, and because Wagner revolutionized music by basically freeing harmonies from their normal tonal chromaticism, and many would argue, including myself, he had also freed them from Jewish Christian morals, so that he could advocate non-Christian and non-Jewish morality. So tonality or lack of it becomes engaged and connected to morals, okay? And the fin de siècle, the moment of decay that happens around 1911, it's fantastic, isn't it, how those terrible world events followed on from that sound, because it is like, my God, I don't want to, if you could make a world out of that sound, would you want to live there? Are you with me? Okay? But the problem was, after Wagner, what do? Wagner is this black hole that just sucks everything in around it, because you can't, after him, again, write simply in the way that you once did. Except in a French cafe, where a very eccentric composer called Satie would play his piano, and he would play little tunes like this. You might recognize it. No rhythm, see? you play this? Bit of practice. Not much. Right? And as he's playing in the cafe and everybody's talking, he doesn't want the music to be listened to because he's French. See, to a Frenchman, making music is like making a piece of furniture or cooking a wonderful dish. It's not like a German who cuts his wrists and it's all going to be about blood and I know, I'm terribly politically incorrect, aren't I? But to the savvy that were listening, they realised this funny fella who lives in a wardrobe, which he did, and when he died they found he had 60 suits that were identical and 60 pairs of shoes that were identical. So he never had to think about what he was going to wear. Would go down to his cafe and play these pieces. People realised this is a solution to Wagner. This is like taking everything back to its kind of roots. It's so simple. And it's almost completely evacuated anything to do with rhythm and tension and anxiety. In fact, it feels like sleep. Peaceful sleeping, dreaming. If you were to make a world out of that piece, would you want to live there? Possibly. We want to read the small print, right? But possibly, okay? Certainly, probably more than Wagner, okay? So what then started happening is the artistic movement in France, and this became, of course, very famous in the 1920s, Nadia Boulanger, people from all over the world went to study in Paris, because neoclassicism, the return of the classical style, whose big hero was a composer called Igor Stravinsky, who had actually written some of the most dissonant music. The Rite of Spring, written around 1913, again just before those wars, right? But then he reacted against it, similarly cleaned his music right out, and was now writing in very much of a neoclassical, like a return to tonality. And so France became this kind of hubbub of this, whoa, here we go, we have an answer. A, we're not German, and B, we think we have something going for us here that will enable us to get away from this German influence that is obviously not going anywhere good, politically speaking. Although everybody admired the art, of course, that was a different business altogether. So then we have composers like this one, and I know you'll recognise this. How many recognise it? See, within just a couple of bars, right? Now, when Ravel wrote this, he wrote this as an exercise in colour. He was appalled when it became his most famous piece. He was absolutely appalled because he considered it to be not really typical of himself as a composer. It was more of an experiment. And as the tune repeats over and over again, as we know it does, so I'm not going to have to play you much of this because you can always play it in your head when I turn it off, right? You know this tune simply moves to different instruments. And like eating a French dinner, it's all about the flavour. It's not really so much about what you're hearing. Yes, there's a rhythm. Yes, there's what we would expect, but our focus is on colour, which has not been a huge focus in classical music up to this point, okay? And of course, the composer that took this, in a sense, to its great height is one of my favourite composers, is Igor Stravinsky. And I'm just going to play you a little bit of the opening of his Symphony of Psalms here, which is one of his great works, 1930, an enormously influential work, and probably the work of his, to display his neoclassicism. The text is about to say, is, "Hear my prayer, O Lord, and with your ears consider my crying. Hold not your peace at my tears, for I am a stranger with you and a sojourner, as all my fathers were. O spare me a little that I may recover my strength before I depart and am no more." And Stravinsky uses the Phrygian mode, which is characterized by a half step at the bottom, as the main idea in this music. What I want you to notice as I play this to you is the colour of the instruments, but also how much repetition there is in the music itself, and how powerfully Stravinsky builds this up. So oboe and bassoon, right? Piano, colour, strings. Da 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 da. That's that half step. dry bassoons. Very unusual music, right? Hear my cry, Lord, and don't stuff me out. Just give me enough to keep going. So although the music is moving forward, and we feel that we're being led forward, we're also when there's a lot of repetition. There's that same half step. You're just fixated on that one interval. The weeping, the crying in sound, if you will. I would so much love you to play the whole of that movement. It kills me. And I know it kills at least one other person for me to stop it at that point. Because it is just absolutely wonderful that. But are you beginning to get this picture of how these materials, it's almost like Lego. It's almost like a type of building with Lego, okay? And to understand this a little bit too, we just need to go back a wee bit to an exhibition in Paris at the end of the 19th century, which featured music from around the world, and composers like Debussy and Ravel heard sounds like this, not Chinese music, but Indonesian gamelan music, which again you'll recognise, which is built up of little rhythmic cells. And rhythms. No harmony as such in the way we would recognise it, but echoes. And again, that's about 15 minutes long, that piece. Okay, so again, you can imagine that people are hearing Satie, they're hearing this music. Neoclassicism is kind of building. Aaron Copland goes to study in the 20s with Nadia Boulanger right around Stravinsky, comes back and tries to imagine, could we have a neoclassical American music? Could we have a sound that sounds like the American, because the funny joke about this, of course, there was no more urban of a person than Aaron Copland. And all of his music is about cowboys and prairies and the great outdoors, right? It's a little bit like the Beach Boys, who we'll get to in a moment, Brian Wilson, right? Who I don't think ever went on a beach, did he? The human imagination is a really remarkable thing, isn't it? Okay. So of course, then we come back to the States, and we hear something really remarkable. I think this is a really tremendous piece of American music. I don't know how many of you know it. Leonard Bernstein, one of my absolute favourite composers. This is a piece called Prelude, Fugue and Riffs. Does anybody know it? Anybody heard it before? Wow, check this one out on YouTube. He's actually conducting it. It's Manhattan, isn't it? It can't be anywhere else. It's not Princeton, let alone London. How did Lenny do that? How did Lenny create Manhattan in sound? You can almost smell the urine. But look, how he's building this out of little riffs. Are you with me? Little repeated rhythms that come from big band music, and then we're striptease music. Again, it kills me to stop it, because that's such, if, okay, I'm a professor, forgive me, but that's a piece of homework for everybody, is go to YouTube, type in Prelude, Fugue and Riffs, Leonard Bernstein, and just watch him conducting without the score those musicians in that performance. And if you can't find it, email me, and I'll send you the link. You mustn't miss out on that. It's too wonderful. Now, to change gear a little bit, now we're going to change gear and pull back a little bit now into moving towards the world of John Adams, and how John Adams would start to apply some of these things possibly. So we have colour. What is the instrument? It's not piano. It's not percussion. What is it? Very repetitive in section. Not a repetition. Colour. Another colour. That's bright. And up you go. Lots of repetition, but it's moving. We're being taken somewhere. Now, I know that hurt you when I stopped it. Okay? And then, just indulge me for a second, another great example, closer to the period of Nixon himself. So we get heavy rock, classic rock. You need cooling, baby, I'm not cooling. Blues, I thought about playing a blues example, but this covers it. Lots of repetitive riffs. Very expressive. Even if expressive on one emotion. Again, colour, what is that? The first song? Right? So we have all of this music. Now, John Adams initially, and here's where we'll change gear just a wee bit, okay? John Adams initially, being very, very intellectual, went to Harvard, went through all the proper training that you were meant to go through. I remember it. I was at the tail end of it, but I remember it. It was like a mafia, the 12-tone mafia, where if you were in an institution, you know that Mahler that I played you when you were like, well, the music, again, I'm speaking of broad generalizations here. The music is, no, let me speak my mind. I'm old enough, okay? The music is incapable of expressing anything other than fear and anxiety. I dare anyone who's playing, you're welcome for the rest of your lives to find a 12-tone piece or an 8-tonal piece that you can send me that doesn't only suggest anxiety. I'll give you an exceptional Stravinsky who wrote it tongue-in-cheek and kept a glint in his eye. There's a little humour in Stravinsky, but are you with me? And so Adams is doing this, and he's like, but I don't want to do this. This is a dead end. So he moves to the West Coast, where minimalism is Terry Riley, for example, has written a piece all about C major. The whole piece is an hour long, and it's just based on C major. What? A whole hour on one? Well, John Lennon had done that in Tomorrow Never Knows on Revolver, right? He'd written the whole song in C, except George Martin, the producer, said, let's make one change. So George Martin put a B flat in there. Okay, fair enough. But the whole piece was meant to be based on Indian music. Oh, can we write a song in one key? Well, or one chord. Well, can we write a whole piece? So in Nixon in China, in Act 2, Scene 2, we have a ballet, okay? And it's called the Chairman Dances. The music has become a separate thing from the opera. It's actually played by orchestras as an orchestral piece. I'm going to jump into Chairman Dances here, but we'll jump around a little bit. Okay, here's the beginning of it. It's almost like a train, right? But Adams is, can you hear how he's focusing on a very limited number of elements, like rock. And the music evolves by rhythmic change or colour changes, not necessarily tonal changes, which will help you when you come to hear it, the whole thing. You'll be able to understand why large stretches of it sound like they are in one spot musically. Okay, so let me jump. I'm just going to jump around. Must be a Broadway show there, right? At that moment. Let's jump forward a little bit more. I don't know where I'm going, I'm just dropping it anyway. This could almost be Puccini. Right? And then again with the rhythms and the build up like Lego. Actually, this is a little bit like Patricia. Then that TikTok, that's American, isn't it? That's 4th of July. That's military bands walking down Princeton High Street on the 4th of July with those. There's almost a romantic feeling. And then last drop. This is the end. So dee dee da da da. Even if you've never heard the music before, you probably now recognise that from an earlier example. So within this music, we can pick up on themes and ideas. Okay, so that's a little bit of John Adams. So that's a little bit of a pocket, like a little bit of a pocket history lesson, in the hope that you feel orientated. That's one of my big goals tonight. Is if I can get everybody to feel orientated, like, okay, I understand why this is what it is. When you're sitting there listening to it, and your mind might drift, as it always does in opera, right? You'll come back thinking, okay, now I absolutely understand what he's trying to do here. He's trying to create a genuine and authentic American music by pulling in all of these different elements. So let's move into part 2 of the talk. Are you guys all right? Are you hanging in there? Are you right with me talking a bit longer? Okay, all right, because we can do questions to break it up if you start getting a bit bored. Just let me know. Or put your hand up and we'll do it, okay? So John Adams doesn't think of his music as being minimalist. In fact, he said rather cleverly, his music is post-style. Post-style. The only trouble is, that's a style. You can't get out of it. You can be disingenuous, but you can't really get out of style, okay? You're going to have a style of some kind because you're using some kind of a musical idea. Now, of course, the composer that worked in 12-tone note rows, which is very mathematical. I don't know whether any of you have any knowledge of serial technique. If you're lucky, you don't. But it's basically about manipulating numbers. It's about taking 12 notes and basically not repeating them in the same format throughout the piece. It's a mathematical process as much as it is a musical process. And Adams had gotten so into this that I think by the time he moved to the West Coast, this minimalism, although it was a completely different sound, revolutionarily different, as different from serial music as Mahler was from that Satie example that I played you a little while ago, 2 different worlds of sound, right? Nonetheless, that mathematical drive could be appealed to by these little Lego ways of writing the music, okay? So here's a couple of things I want us to think about. Once he sets off a rhythm, okay, it becomes a process. Almost as though, once you set it up, you can step back and let it run. Are you with me? Is that making sense to everybody? So once you set up layers of rhythm one on top of each other, once you've set the rhythm off, okay, just keep going. And it'll be fascinating to see how they match or they don't match, okay? Is often what happens, okay? And what is interesting to me here, in the context of this opera, okay, is what does this technique tell us about something that is unyielding, and something that is free. The stereotypical idea of communism as a system that meticulously controls the behaviour. I just watched Chernobyl. Have you guys seen that on HBO? Wow, what a show. It's just unbelievable, okay? And the extent to which a state will go to control its image, the lies, you know, the way it just absolutely almost wants to control every single aspect of its population, versus us, okay, where we're meant to be the land of the free, okay? So for Adams, one of the interesting things I think to anybody who messes with minimalism in this kind of way is what is the balance between total control and freedom? And you guys are going to sense this when you hear the opera. When you're in that hall, you're going to hear music that will seem to go on interminably sometimes, not in a bad way, because the interminability of it is a part of the communication of what's going on, okay? But when you see Nixon step off the plane and say, news, 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 news has a strange kind of mystery. News has I can't imagine an American president thinking that, can you? News has a strange kind of mystery. And he goes over, news, 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 news has a, news has, news has a, news has a kind of, news has a kind of mystery. It has a kind of mystery. News has a it's like, okay, Dickie, we got it. But you see, the beauty of the technique is it takes a line of text and it enables you to see it in 3D. Rather than just seeing it as a line, it enables you to step back and think, well, what did Nixon think about the news? What does Trump think about it? What is the news to those people? It may be a person in their imagination that they're dealing with. I mean, it's above my pay grade. I'm only guessing. But the opera, Adams can suddenly throw us in. One of the things Adams said, because he didn't initially want to do this, that Peter Sellers, the stage director, suggested it to him. He's like, oh, I don't want to do that as an opera. But then as he started to work on it, he began to realise that Nixon was actually a much more, of course he was, so is Trump. They're much more nuanced than we're led to believe, probably even more nuanced than they are to themselves in some strange way. And one of the great things about minimalism is in all this repetition, you begin to gradually notice subtle changes. Oh, if your ear is really tuned in, right, you can start to hear these nuances. Oh, that's interesting. Look at that. And one of the things that he does is he does metric modulation. In other words, what Adams will often do is he'll change, he'll be going he'll suddenly distort the rhythm, almost as though he's changing key. In tonal music, only he's not changing key, he's changing the rhythm, almost as if the changing of rhythm is itself communicating something kind of dramatic, okay? So this idea of Western music and Asian music and where the two meet and what they represent spiritually and emotionally is very, very, very interesting. You've probably all heard of the Apollonian and Dionysian aesthetic, right? Where the Greek idea of beauty is Apollo, who represents absolute order. Everything is immaculate, okay? He's the god of the sun, okay? And then over here we have the god Dionysus, who actually wasn't a Greek god, he was an imported Indian god. But he's a god of wine, a god of emotion, a god of meaning. And so the Greeks had this theory that beauty is right in the middle of total control and total expression. Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Apollo and Dionysus. Mozart, early Mozart. Beethoven, late Beethoven. Okay, you've got the control freak and you've got the passionate person over here. How does minimalism negotiate that? Obviously, it's intuitive, isn't it? That minimalism should be a classical technique. It's obviously all about control. But in opera, you can't just have control. You have to let go of control because you're dealing with human beings, often in very dramatic circumstances. And let me tell you this, the first act of the opera is very public and rhetorical, and the second act and the third act are very intimate. If you find at the end of the first act, you think to yourself, I can hang in there, but I'm not too sure how much more of that I can take. Not that you will, not in a bad way, but you will be relieved, if that's the right word, by the second and third acts, which take you into a much more intimate kind of world. It's almost as though the political processes overwhelm the first act, whereas the personal interrelationships between people become what happens then in the second and in the third act. Okay? Let me just cut down here. I think I'm covering a lot of the things that I want to cover here. Yeah, let's listen to a little bit more music, okay? So I want to show you now one example only in the opera. It's actually from the first act, where we get the contrast between the process, the simple process at the beginning of the act, before Nixon actually touches down on the runway, and then at the end of the act, where they're all drinking. Dionysus, right? Cheers, 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 cheers. And we find that what Adams does is he uses the word cheers, which is a word that we all use a lot. We don't think about it much, right? But probably most days at some point we probably go cheers, okay? But he uses that very generic word to focus harmony on. Take a listen to this. And then we'll wrap things up and we'll take some questions because we're nearly there. Let me just, hold on just a second. I've triggered off the wrong thing here. Okay, so here's the opening of the opera, hopefully. Yes, here we go. This is the very opening. It's just Ionian mode. But at different points in the bar, right? It's got a lilt to it. In a movie, we would think possibly they're expecting something in the film. It's like this air of expectation. And of course, in the opera, it's the arrival of Nixon in the spring of 76. Feeling sleepy yet? You're never going to make it. But it is soporific, right? Have you ever been at an airport waiting for someone to arrive? So it's appropriately soporific. He's not a bad composer writing boring music. He's trying to induce a feeling of have you got the idea? We're about 1 minute in. Okay. So that's an extreme example of minimalism in this opera. It's probably about as minimalist as it gets because there's a lot more that goes on in the music later. Now let me play you the bit you've all been waiting for, the drinking scene, with cheers. Wow, chords! I'm moving. And of course, the minimalist language is opening itself, right? To bring in jazz, rock, pop. Although we're still in minimalism,
Washington's birthday,
Washington's birthday,
Washington's birthday, Washington's birthday,
like a broken record.
Washington's birthday.
Cheers, 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 cheers. Can you imagine being a chorus member having to memorize that? Listen.
Just let her say one thing. I will pose to China. I will pose to China. I will pose to China. I was
Everybody's almost opposed to China now, right? Wow, right? mind, before I left the home to come here, they were talking about how badly wine's doing in Upper Valley. They said which Nixon made famous, like, when he lifted up the wine in China. Before I came into that. What? Just the auction. Cheers. But you guys can also tell that by simply manipulating those harmonies, cheers can also become sinister, right? Because by arranging the harmonies in certain ways, although it's a certain social convention, and you can all think of parties that we've probably been at, where hostilities, petty hostilities, are lurking under the surface of the apparent bonhomie on the top of it. Well, this technique has the ability to be able to recreate that exact effect. The very last thing I want to mention very quickly is a question, I suppose. And that is, does strictly minimalist processes suggest classical notions of fate? If I saw John Adams, I met him once, but if I saw him today, I'd ask him this, right? Does minimalism suggest classical notions of fate, behavior that you can't escape, which goes back to classical paganism? Or does it incorporate Judeo-Christian ideas of freedom of choice? And to what extent does the use of process in the music that you just set off? So Nixon has to be carried along on these rhythms he can't control, right? In the music. To what extent then does his appearance of freedom of choice play a role in musical decisions that happen? And in this way I give John Adams a great deal of credit. What an amazing thing to be able to take a technique like minimalism and make it truly dramatic. I can't think of a more potently undramatic type of musical composition than minimalism. It's antithetical when you stop and think about it to the expression of emotion. I think one of the great things John Adams has been able to do in this opera, which has made it an opera that's going to go on and on, no accident that Princeton Festival is doing it this year, is precisely because he was able to achieve that. Thank you. Now I will shut up and over to you. Questions or comments?
Actually, I have a comment and a question. I understand now how some of this, and I don't know much about this kind of music, but if you've ever seen the film The Lion in Winter, and the very opening of the theme was exactly that same kind of construction, medieval rhythmic chordal structure that you had in the Stravinsky.
Yeah.
So now I understand where they got that from.
And that's a great observation. And there are two things. Did everybody hear that? In The Lion in Winter, there was news of, and I think there are two quick answers back. One doesn't necessarily apply to film music. One is that in 20th century music, with tonality being now eradicated from music in certain compositions, ostinato and repetition becomes the glue that holds that music together. And also, how perfect for a Hollywood movie is minimalism. Because the director says, "Oi, I need you to cut 30 seconds of the music." Well, I mean, minimalism is in a sense self-recommending in that sense. I think of Hans Zimmer, for example, the Dark Knight movies. Yeah. Anybody's seen The Dark Knight, the Batmans with Christopher Nolan, right? Where he uses his big chord. It's brilliant because you can cut those, if it's not edited to that exact music and the director turns around, you're not going to want to murder him because you can just easily cut a few chords out. So yes, I think it's a gift to film composers.
But my question was, going all the way back, when you talk about the kind of variations in the theme and all these rhythmic things, and yet, okay, so this is new, but wasn't that exactly what Johann Sebastian Bach did in his inventions?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's why it's neoclassical. It's neoclassical because in a sense it's going back to the processes that the early composers used before tonality began to be corrupted by too much modulation. If you like, it's almost like a second naivety. If you think of the classical period as a first naivety, right, and this is like a post-experience return to innocence, but with your eyes fully open, okay? Because a composer like him is not using tonality in exactly the same way a classical composer would, obviously. To some extent, he's always using it with inverted commas. It's certainly using Aeolian, but it's But I'm choosing to do it not because I'm a composer that can't write really sophisticated music, but I'm deliberately choosing Aeolian because I'm going to write in this style. Does that make sense to everybody? So it's almost like you're using quotation marks around it. But you're absolutely right, that's neoclassicism.
It sort of struck me that what you have is almost a return to Mahler, too, without the angst.
Yes.
Because you have the full chords and you have the level of sound, but you have a
You're
different
right.
emotional
You're right.
color to it.
You're absolutely right. Did you hear what was said there? It's almost like the music can almost return to Mahler. Cheers would be a good example of that, right? In that you could almost arrange any number of chords that in a sequence that Mahler might use, but because of the sound, it Americanizes it. I'm not going to go as far as saying Hollywood or Walt Disneyfies it, but there is certainly an element of Americanization about the sounds that seems to, if not eradicate anxiety, it conceals it. Is that an American thing? Certainly an English thing. We're very experts at being repressed, right? So you could ask all kinds of psychological questions about, okay, so what's that mean in terms of the way Adams uses those kinds of, but your observation is absolutely right. Here's another brilliant aspect to your question too, is that this technique is open, it somehow, do you know how hip hop, were you not all amazed when Hamilton came out? And scratched your head and went, a hip hop musical, a musical of hip hop, 3 hours. You couldn't have imagined that, right? And it's proven, hip hop has proven to be this unbelievably flexible form, okay? In the same way, Adams, I think, recognized that through this use of exactly the kind of techniques we're talking about, the language of the past, and even up to Mahler, he's able to bring in Bernstein, Copland, maybe even refer to Bach, maybe even refer to Mahler in exactly the way you guys have identified, because this technique allows him to do it. And in that's a very Mahlerian thing, because he's putting his arms around the whole musical world. He's having his cake and eating it, which was exactly Mahler's vision of what a symphony should be. So I think that's a great observation, actually, about Mahler. Yes?
Was Gould a great predecessor to Adams?
Say it one more time.
Gould, what is it? And Einstein on the beach. Who wrote that?
Oh, Philip Glass.
Right, okay.
Yes, yeah, Philip Glass. And I think John Adams has a very passive-aggressive relationship with Philip Glass. you know, a lot of composers do. The guy I studied at in England, Benjamin Britten, had a very, very extremely antagonistic relationship with Vaughan Williams. And also, actually, there was a real, almost, do you know the play Amadeus? My theory about that play is it's based on Benjamin Britten and William Walton. With Salieri being William Walton, actually. Because oftentimes a composer has to be in competition with something. I've been philosophically thinking over the last few months, I'm taking you into my world, indulge me for a moment. Is competition ever a good thing? Now, I know your immediate response to that, because we're living in the heart of capital. But I've actually started to, in my mind, I've been playing around with the ideas, is competition, what would the world be like if competition vanished completely? What kind of world would it be? I think it would be fantastic. Fantastic. But we are so brainwashed in our society that we can only think, no, competition's got to be good. I wouldn't do anything without competition, which then makes me go, then who are you? Right? Very, very interesting. But yeah, no, absolutely. So Philip Glass, I think, certainly at this time, John Adams saw Philip Glass as a lazy minimalist, so to speak. His opinion may have changed since, but certainly in this period that we're dealing with, that's the case, yeah. And he was one of the leading minimalists on the East Coast, as opposed to the West Coast. Yes?
Well, I've seen a flowering tree. The only full-blown Adams operas I've seen are The Death of Klinghoffer and Dr. Atomic. Do you think he's drawn to controversy more than maybe some other composers are?
I think all good opera composers are,
Fair enough.
right? I mean, going back to Amadeus for a moment, why did Mozart choose really subjects that were really suicidal culturally? He picked subjects that were so politically outrageously incorrect, right? Why did Shostakovich stay in the Soviet Union and write symphonies knowing that if Stalin walked out, he would be killed? Because he thought, I might be a mediocre composer, but if Stalin sits there and doesn't kill me, I've got to be some kind of genius. Are you with me? For Wagner, it was, in the Ring cycle, let me sell incest. If I can sell incest, I'll know I'm king. Or Tristan and Isolde, let me sell adultery. If I can get them to spend millions of dollars renovating their opera houses, you know what I'm talking about, right? The Met, who ripped out the floor and spent millions building a set for the Ring, which is an opera that advocates incest, and many other immoralities. Wagner sits back and watches the audiences flowing and the millions of dollars coming in and goes, well, I must be some kind of genius. So there's an irony here. Now, here's the thing about Dr. Atomic, because this touches a bit on Chernobyl. Isn't it fantastic that the atomic bomb, or the atomic, the whole quantum mechanic world are processes? Could John Adams have picked a better subject than the nuclear bomb? As a minimalist, right? Because he's dealing with cells, cellular motives that rotate, just like the molecular structure of atoms and subatomic particles. So I remember that coming out, and I remember hearing it, and I remember feeling actually that was really a powerful piece. And I think he found, like Bernstein did in West Side Story, he found the perfect story actually to accommodate his technique in Dr. Atomic, which Princeton Festival will be doing in 3 years' time. That's probably going to be very expensive to do. But no, I think you're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
When I read the description of your talk, I was curious to understand what minimalism is. And I came up with 2 definitions as you talked. An early one, which I was understanding your early remarks to kind of suggest a kind of conservation of compositional elements.
Like the neoclassical aspect, you mean?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And then later, as you filled in the story, I came to a different understanding, which is this kind of what I maybe call maintaining an equilibrium between control or highly structured and freedom.
Yeah.
At the other
Yeah.
extreme, lack of structure. So is that roughly on the point?
Yeah, absolutely. And here's an interesting thing about neoclassicism within musicology. Neoclassicism, precisely because it's reactionary, it's reacting against the 12-tone school of the German atonal system, has been daubed reactionary, conservative, with political implications. Now, with the death of Klinghoffer, for example, which is very controversial, probably all as Americans, probably all aware to some extent of the fact that he's been accused of siding with the Palestinians against Israel in that opera. There's a whole, which of course is frankly denied, right? But it's very, very interesting that the musical style of neoclassicism has consistently been connected to a very reactionary, even ultra, in some cases, ultra right-wing type of reactionary, depending on the degree of control, right, and the degree of chaos, which is another very, very interesting political brew. We're opening some cans of worms here tonight, aren't we? As something yet another sort of very complicated way of appreciating what he does in this opera. Nixon was, of course, considered to be an ultra-right person, and one of the great things about the whole Chinese thing is he actually said, I got it wrong. I got it wrong, you know, which was almost a miracle, all right? So fascinating that he's an ultra-conservative guy set in a minimalist opera who evolves to a point where he can admit he's wrong, he can let go. And as the opera progresses, we find more and more of that kind of harmonic movement coming in, a little bit more of a unsettled equilibrium. And this would be something that, when you're sitting in the opera in a few weeks, you can get a kick out of this. You can sort of say, okay, let's see where he starts out here. Where does he take Nixon on this journey? And what is he actually doing in the music? How does it unfold? To tell us about this guy who's always been painted as an absolutely despicable person. I mean, that's certainly how I grew up thinking of Nixon. It's very unfair, because everybody's a lot more nuanced than that, right? But very, very interesting question. Yeah.
Perhaps we should have 1 or 2 more questions.
So,
I think we're all cowed at
This is actually not a question, it's an observation, but to share with. So in preparation for the opera, I recently read Margaret McMillan's book, Nixon in China, the
fascinating insight there. Henry Kissinger, when he went on his secret trip to China, which nobody knew about, did not trust the State Department translators. So he took no American interpreters with him, and he relied entirely on the Chinese interpreters because he didn't trust the state. I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
Truth is stranger than fiction, right? And you know in that ballet, the evil character in the ballet is the same character that plays Kissinger in the opera. So there's definitely a little bit of a poke in the ribs going on in the opera. But yeah, very interesting. Very, very interesting.
I was just struck by the person who wrote the libretto. Can you make a comment about her?
Alice Scribner's libretto. All I can tell you about it is they fought. They fought a lot. There was a lot of, they were fiercely, she wanted certain things and they didn't, and they had to really, really thrash things out.
Which comes first?
I think, say again?
Does the music come before the libretto, or?
I don't know this particular work well enough in that sense of the background to know in what cases it did and didn't. I can tell you from the work I've done on Benjamin Britten that very often times once the librettist and the composer have gotten together and the composer knows the general direction, it's not uncommon for musical ideas then to quickly sprout wings. But as to how that happens in this particular opera, I can't really, I'm not expert enough to be able to comment on that. I'm sorry. You might have to Google it. One more?
I was just wondering, you were talking about control and freedom in terms of the music and those patterns. So how does the voice then work in terms of control and freedom on top of that? How was he conceiving of, does he have a very traditional sense of an operatic voice, or has he changed the operatic voice?
Well, let me maybe turn that in a constructive way back to everybody as an assignment. Will there be a melody, when you walk out of this opera, will there be a melody that you'll sing? It'd be interesting to ask the singers, wouldn't it? Whether they actually walk around singing tunes from this opera. But let me point that at everybody here. Because there is melody in this piece, right? But of course, modern composers are very anxious about melody because, again, it can be a little bit karaoke. You don't want the melody to sound a little bit too much like this person, or you get daubed with a brush of not original plagiarism. Yeah, when you're being lazy, you're using this technique so you can get away with copying Puccini, but pretend it's minimalism. You can imagine where those debates will go. But that is a very, very good question, and the degree to which John Adams is successful in creating what you and I would call singable melody, and how he does that in this opera is a very, very interesting question. And that, in a sense, is like a little homework assignment I'll leave you with. Again, to give you something to look out for in the operatic production. As you can see tonight, I wore my minimalist shirt. Cheers, 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 cheers. Thank you very much, everybody.